Chapter 17. For several weeks after my rejection by the medical board, I lived on borrowed money, and without warning them, crawled around to the houses of my friends at meal times. Getting back into a commercial studio turned out to be impossible. Whenever I applied for a job, I was careful to explain that I was totally exempt, but I was always obliquely accused of being a pacifist. Even when I protested that I was one of the few people who actually liked the war, I still didn't get taken on. The only money that I can remember earning at this time came from Mr. Hall. Without ever having met me, he telephoned me to ask if I would allow him to paint my portrait. When I asked if he would be willing to pay me, he said with frankness, "Only if it's absolutely necessary." It was. The moment that he opened the door of his studio to me, I recognized him as one of the landmarks of the district. I had often witnessed him in King's Road, wearing a huge black hat and a stiff pointed beard, with which it would have been possible to scrub the sink. He was the first real artist that I had ever met. I was delighted that he looked so perfectly the part. His home was also the first studio that I had ever entered. I exclude those bed sitting rooms, which are so sparsely furnished and so lavishly unkempt that their occupants feel the only thing to do is call them studios. My friends, even those that lived in Chelsea, received the news that Mr. Hall was painting me, and might do a picture of me in the nude, with amused contempt mixed here and there with a sickening archness. Some openly suggested that he had proposed this out of sexual curiosity. Even in those days, long before Mary Quant and John Stevens turned the place into a vast boutique for the rich, Chelsea was evidently not, as advertised, the home of the broad-minded. It was merely lousy with people who lacked the nerve or the energy to give positive expression to moral judgment. Indeed, if a bohemian is someone without prejudices and without roots, then what there was of the vie de bohème seemed to reside in Mr. Hall. I was flattered by his interest in me and charmed by his courtesy. He utterly lacked the brutish iconoclasm with which many seek to establish themselves as characters. His melancholy dignity, however, baffled me. I sometimes thought he would have liked to shed this, but couldn't. He answered with candor even such questions as, "Why do you paint?" But I never got to know him, and I tried. I tried hard, for I wanted to enter the world of which I felt he was a consul, though I knew that I would be an impostor there. I don't hold with art. The only time I gave a gracious nod in the direction of culture was when Surrealism came to London. This movement appealed to me, because the pictures executed under its banner were akin to the works which my mother had directed my attention to in childhood. Their especial quality was Victorianism, now put into a perverse form. I was only sorry that this was not enhanced by giving the painting such titles as "The Blight of the World" or "When Did You Last Rape Your Father?" In spite of this minor disappointment, I went to the famous exhibition in the Burlington Galleries, where I found myself an unwitting, though not entirely unwilling, exhibit. In and out of the different rooms glided a certain Mrs. Ligg, wearing full evening dress and carrying in her hand an uncooked pork chop. With orange face and vermilion lips I weaved my way past her, clanking with amulets. But as her face was entirely covered by a hood of roses, I could not see whether she registered fear that I might be a materialization of the surreal world, or annoyance that another voluntary worker had got his rota mixed with hers. For a moment one of the dearest wishes of surrealism was fulfilled. The barriers between art and life fell down. Subsequently, cultural trends soon restored and even reinforced them. I came out on the side of reality. I began to feel that art was not merely superfluous, but actually insulting to life. Its implication was that the visible world was intolerable unless a bunch of amateurs at the creation business shoved it around. For this reason I never wanted to paint, but hoped to borrow a phrase from the jargon of a later aesthetic movement, that I might become an objet trouvé in the world of art. Some of this hostility to culture I may have expressed when talking to Mr. Hall. If I did, it may have formed a part of the barrier between us. I got to know slightly better a writer who occasionally came and sat with us while Mr. Hall worked at my portrait. I attended a small party at this man's house. One of the guests, who managed to wear his naval uniform as though it were really only fancy dress, sang himself to bits. He shouted, shuddered, hooted, until the sweat poured down his face, and his hair fell into his eyes. Among the young, such behavior is now as common as smoking reefers, but at that time it was a startling phenomenon. I enjoyed his performance a little less for fearing that he might have a stroke. I need not have worried. Soon he was carrying on like this several times a night. It was Mr. Melly. He had a genius for getting others to see a joke as he saw it, and this won my admiration. But whenever we met in later years, my part of our conversations consisted chiefly in saying, "Shh, shh." Mr. Melly had to be obscene to be believed. In all, Mr. Hall painted 3 portraits of me. The fees he paid me for sitting for these were very helpful, but I had the misfortune to outlive them. I reached the end of my tether, and the tethers of most of my friends. I was rescued by the documentary movie industry. Chapter 18. I seemed always to be walking along a corridor flanked by doors barred against all knocking, all entreaty. These were interspersed with other doors, looking exactly similar, but which opened almost before I reached them. I now came to one of these. While I had been living the furnished life in Chelsea, among the inmates of the house in which I lodged had been the secretary of a film producer. As well as she could, she had explained me to her employer. Without seeing one of the dingy letterheads and layouts of advertisements in such papers as the Fur Times and the Cactus Journal, which were pasted into my book of specimens, he had offered me the job of lettering the titles of a number of travelogues he had made in Pinkest Petra and other cities of the Near East. All but one of these had been distributed before the war started. The remaining one was now brought forward by another producer, who, when my work for him was finished, distributed me among the poor of the documentary industry. I could hardly keep pace with the work, partly because there was so much of it, and partly because the lettering of a film was never commissioned until a few days before the trade show. The movie business had a genius for bringing some kind of chaos out of order. Of course, lettering credits was another form of commercial art. It required the speed, the high gloss that I had always lacked. But because it was connected with the movies, for me it had glamour. I flailed my limbs so wildly in my efforts to cling on that at one moment I caught hold by accident of an art directorship. I had been called by telephone to the top floor of the building over a Chinese restaurant in Wardour Street. When I arrived, I was asked by a man with a delicatessen accent if I would paint the sets of a film that was to go into production there the next day. I had never painted scenery in my life, but I said I would if he would tell me what I was to do. When I turned up the following day, this man was not present, though a great many other people were. None of these seemed to know anyone else, or to have the faintest idea what he himself had been hired for. I wandered around the room, eavesdropping at various uneasy conversations, as though I had gate-crashed a dull party, until I arrived in a corner where one man was asking another, "Well, what's it supposed to look like?" Then he had an idea. "Let's ask that bloke with the funny—" "Oh, here you are," he said as he caught sight of me. Explaining to the other man, he added, "He's the art director." "Oh, am I?" I squeaked, delighted but surprised. With the swiftness of a tropical sunset, assurance faded from the faces of both men. My moment of glory had come and gone. Working for the movies was the first job I ever wanted to do for reasons other than to show I could. For once, though I was prepared to accept defeat, I did not intend to embrace it. I wanted to be what would now be described as the Saul Bass of British movies, and to this end I abandoned for a moment my existentialist posture. I applied for and, to my amazement, obtained a job in studio film laboratories. This was a mistake. I was not able to flit from room to room, learning the secret of the celluloid universe. I was confined to the art department, where, even if my ineptitude had not almost immediately been unmasked, I do not think I would have lasted long. My presence caused agony to the head of the studio. From lifelong habit, I called him Sir, never noticing that every time I did so he winced. Also, after a few weeks, he became aware that other members of his staff had learned by heart and were starting to use the detestable curlicues with which my discourse was decorated, nay, fluttered, and which later came to be called Crisperanto. Within 9 months, I had once again been given the sack. All that I had succeeded in doing was to go out of circulation for long enough for most of my movie connections to forget about me. Life was a funny thing that happened to me on the way to the grave. I had never thought of my progress, perhaps we had better say my movement, through time as a triumphal march, but at this point I felt that I had stumbled. It is only when looking at an aerial shot taken by memory that I see now how little was lost by my failure in the movie industry. If I have any talent at all, it is not for doing, but for being. In the humblest way, this I was now given the opportunity to demonstrate. I became a model.